Before grocery stores and highways existed, surviving a Canadian winter meant stockpiling the right foods or dying. Indigenous peoples and settlers developed preservation methods Americans in milder climates never needed. These 7 items were the difference between life and starvation in the frozen north. With the first hard frost, Canadian families faced a calculation that shaped every autumn how much meat would see them through to spring. The answer was measured in barrels, sometimes as many as 30, stacked in cellars or buried in sheds, each packed with salted pork or beef. The full slaughter was a communal ordeal. Neighbours gathered to butcher livestock, strip meat, and layer it with coarse salt in oak barrels sealed with pitch. The work was cold and relentless. Susanna Moody, writing from her backwoods homestead, captured the anxiety when she wrote that the hams and sides were salted down in barrels for winter use, and that the thought of running short chilled her heart more than the frost outside. A single spoiled barrel could mean hunger before the thaw. Diaries from the 19th century mention cellars holding anywhere from 5 to 30 barrels, depending on the size of the farm and the mouths to feed. On the prairies, where isolation stretched for hundreds of kilometers, families salted more than they needed, fearing blizzards that could last weeks and the cold that made hunting or resupply impossible. Overproduction became a habit, a hedge against the unknown. South of the border, American families in the Midwest salted pork too, but their winters were shorter, towns closer and markets open year-round. Fresh meat from the smokehouse or a neighbour's farm was rarely out of reach. In Canada, the barrel was not a backup, it was the backbone of winter survival. Beside the meat barrels stood the flour sacks, prairie ledgers from the 1870s record families hauling home 2, sometime 4, 100-pound sacks from the mill before the first snow. These sacks, stacked in root cellars and granaries, were as vital as firewood. Bread, bannock and porridge all depended on that flour, which had to last until the next harvest. Families protected it from damp and mice with straw and earth. In emergencies, whole communities pooled their stocks, like when the Northwest Mounted Police requisitioned 15 sacks during the Riel Rebellion of 1885. In the United States, wheat and corn were abundant and railroads brought flour year-round. Few American households needed to store flour in such bulk. In Canada, the 100-pound sack became a symbol of self-reliance, a bulwark against isolation. Every full barrel and heavy sack was a promise. You might make it through to spring. Underground, the fight for survival played out in near darkness. Sand-packed root cellars dug deep below the frost line became vaults for the season's last fresh vitamins. Potatoes, carrots and turnips hauled from the earth before the first snow were stacked in bins and covered with straw. The cold air slowed decay, but nothing could stop the threat of water. In the Red River settlement, the flood of 1847 filled cellars with icy runoff, turning precious stores into rot. Church records from that spring list up to 24 deaths from starvation and disease, the direct result of ruined winter vegetables. When the ground froze again, there was no way to replace what was lost. Entire communities pooled what little remained, handing out emergency grain rations and hoping the thaw would come early. Indigenous ingenuity provided answers to fragile root stores born of centuries of adaptation. The Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee dried squash, beans and corn known as the Three Sisters, hanging them from rafters or spreading them on bark mats to catch the last warmth of the autumn sun. Dried kernels and beans kept for months without spoiling, a method settlers quickly learned to copy. But even the best-stocked cellar could not offer sweetness. Imported cane sugar was rare and expensive, its price driven up by distance and tariffs. In its place, communities turned to the forest. Each spring, as the snow melted, Anishinaabe families moved into the sugar bush. Sap was gathered in birch buckets and boiled for days over open fires, thickening into dense maple sugar cakes. These cakes, hard as stone and packed in cedar boxes, became both a trade good and a morale booster, one of the few sweets that survived the long cold. French-Canadian settlers scaled up the practice, producing hundreds of kilograms each season. In the early 1800s, a single camp could make over 300 kilograms, enough to last the winter and barter for tools or cloth at distant trading posts. South of the border, American families rarely faced such deprivation. Milder winters meant root cellars were less likely to flood or freeze, and cane sugar arrived by rail or riverboat year-round. Canadian ingenuity, born of necessity, made every root and every drop of sap matter. When the cellars failed, it was the memory of sweet maple and the hope of spring that kept families going. The next challenge, though, would come from the sea. Salt barrels weren't just for pork and beef. Along the Atlantic coast, cod filled the same role. Stacked in cellars, salted hard, and packed into oak barrels by the dozen. In St. John's, merchant records from the late 1700s list entire shipments of cod, with a portion held back each autumn for local use. Outport families counted on 8 or 10 barrels to see them through ice-locked months, when storms cut off fresh supplies and even the hardiest fishermen stayed ashore. Without livestock, cod became the backbone of winter protein. Letters from the era warn of the fear that swept a village when the cod barrels ran low before spring. Cod wasn't just a meal, it was a hedge against starvation. On the Pacific coast, a different rhythm played out. Here, First Nations communities built massive cedar racks, some stretching the length of a house, to dry salmon in the late summer sun. Archaeological digs along the Fraser and Skeena rivers reveal racks that once held up to 3 tons of fish, enough to feed a village through the wet, unpredictable winter. The drying process was a marvel of precision. Salmon fillets, split and hung in rows, dried by wind and smoke, then packed in cedar boxes. No salt needed, no barrels to roll. The dried salmon kept for months and travelled well, traded deep into the interior for berries, roots or furs. Unlike most Americans who could buy fresh fish or meat from markets almost year-round, Canadians, especially in isolated coastal or inland settlements, had to turn the bounty of the summer sea into a winter lifeline. In both East and West, the ocean's harvest was transformed by skill and necessity, bridging the gap between isolation and survival. On the open grasslands, survival sometimes came down to what could be carried on your back. Pemmican, a dense, high-calorie mix of dried bison meat, rendered fat and wild berries, became the fuel of the fur trade and the ultimate emergency ration for indigenous hunters, meaties traders, and explorers alike. Making pemmican demanded precision and teamwork. After the summer bison hunt, strips of lean meat were dried in the sun and pounded into powder. Women rendered marrow fat over open fires, then poured it into the meat, adding handfuls of dried Saskatoon berries for vitamins and taste. The mixture was packed into rawhide bags or birch bark containers, each one weighing up to 90 pounds. A single production cycle could yield 250 kilograms, enough to keep a band of 30 people alive through months of travel or siege. Unlike salted pork or hardtack, pemmican didn't spoil or freeze solid, and each kilogram packed nearly 5,500 calories, making it the unrivaled staple for journeys across the northern plains. But pemmican wasn't just food, it was power. In 1814, Governor Miles MacDonnell of the Red River Colony issued the Pemmican Proclamation, banning its export to starve out rival fur traders and secure supplies for settlers. The law struck at the heart of Métis and Cree economies, sparking a series of raids and reprisals known as the Pemmican War. Company clerks recorded the seizure of hundreds of bags, and the colony teetered on the edge of famine as tempers flared. For indigenous families, pemmican was more than a trade good. It was ancestral knowledge, survival insurance, and a symbol of autonomy. Meanwhile, just across the border, American settlers relied on army rations, fresh pork or hardtack, rarely needing such extreme measures. The Canadian winter and the threat of isolation turned pemmican into a survival currency, fought over in courts and on the land. Even today, its legend lives on with northern preppers and Arctic expeditions, a reminder that in Canada, food could shape the fate of nations. Today, as fragile supply chains and climate extremes test our sense of security, these old Canadian methods, born of necessity, find new relevance. Survival isn't just history here, it's a blueprint. The ingenuity behind pemmican and root cellars still offers lessons for anyone planning for the unknown. What would you stockpile?